Okay, so no illusion of time difference here. I'm not going to try and trick you and say that this is months apart and we've got together and really this is back to back. Nick Wells, Vice Principal responsible for teaching and learning, English Remnant World for the blog. And I've desperately asked Nick for some advice on teaching non-fiction writing. I feel it was something I got a bit tangled up in last year. So Nick, if I just tell you a little bit about some of the mistakes I made, maybe the mistakes other people have made, or maybe
they may well be mistakes I've made, Todd.
So what I did was I set off on this ambitious journey of pathos, ethos, logos, chiasmus, all these terms and techniques, ancient rhetoric techniques. And then I structured them in this really sort of formulaic way. Paragraph 1 should do this. Paragraph 2 is your counter argument. So I'd really drilled down almost to the point of use this type of sentence for your counter argument. And the students, the writing was so stilted, and it was a class of, I had a really good relationship with them and they worked really hard, except for nonsense. And they just stopped. And it was the cognitive load we were talking about earlier. And they, for ages, scrapped it eventually, but I persisted probably at least 2 lessons too long. It was this really sentence structure heavy that I went for. Maybe if I persisted, it would have worked, but it was a disaster. So I'd like to know what you did. Maybe you went on a similar journey. Maybe you made that a success. Maybe you had a structured approach. But could you just tell us what you did to non-fiction writing?
Todd, when you're talking now, are you talking specifically about Year 11 class that you're?
I am talking about Year 11,
yeah.
but relevant to all year groups, I suppose. But we could drill down.
So what we did was, I think it's important to frame as a reaction to the mocks last December that we did, that in terms of data, both numerical data for what mock predictions were worth last year when we were all predicting on grades in the dark, but more importantly in terms of students' work, it wasn't good. And I don't think anyone would have wanted the results that we were predicting last December. But what we did certainly had an impact on the quality of writing that students were able to produce by the summer, and the predictions we gave in December were very different to the results we had in the summer. So they made seemingly, whatever progress is, they made lots of progress. Certainly there was an improvement in the quality of their writing from a really low base. And I think it's important to say that because how I'm going to answer your question about what we did in terms of non-fiction is through some principles rather than through saying do exactly this.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't do exactly what we did with our students if you had students in the December of Year 11 who were attaining highly already in terms of their non-fiction writing, but you might do some of the following things. So one of the things we gave to us, especially the students who weren't performing well in December, was a structure they could use. And it was a fairly straightforward kind of 5-section structure. And we tried to avoid a lot of the Elizabethan rhetoric that we are teaching to our Year 7s and 8s in order to make sure that by their December of Year 11, they're in a much better position. So because we felt that there wasn't enough time to do the kinds of things that you've just described. Though I can understand why people did, because a lot of the exam boards were saying students need to know much better terminology because it improves their analysis, and have now turned around and are saying actually the use of terminology is less important than the analysis itself, which I get and agree with, really.
Yeah.
So we avoided a lot of the Elizabethan rhetoric, but what we did do was give students a structure. And I know a lot of people are using the structure strips. I've just sort of mentioned those at the end of the last chat we had. Alongside the strip, we had a model that they could emulate. And for a lot of the students that were presenting as low ability, that model and emulation approach, almost copying from the model, but adapting it for the task that was set, that really helped them. So in some cases, it lifted them up by about 10, 15 marks, just because, like with the descriptive writing, they weren't writing enough, and what they were writing wasn't clearly structured. So there was a structure that we provided and a model that we provided. And I think you could do that for whatever attainment level your students are currently at. And then we got them to practice it to the extent that they were almost rote learning the models and the structures that we were giving them. So we would have a writing practice session every week where they would sit with a task and they would respond to that task in 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And then myself and the head of English, and who is amazing, and some of the other members of the Year 11 teaching team would mark those. And then we'd give them, most of the time, whole cohort feedback on the things that they weren't doing well enough yet, so that the next week they could try those things. And over time, that gradually improved the quality of the writing that we were seeing. So it was pragmatic and a response to the results in December. But actually, even though we were kind of training them to jump through exam hoops, most of them ended up leaving Year 11 as better non-fiction writers alongside that.
I mean, imitation is the only way, really, to start with those low students. I think you mentioned the word pragmatism. I mean, if there ever was a time for pragmatism, it would be with this changeover from the old GCSE to the new. I mean, it feels like a time to be a chosen new teacher and not get 30 on level. In my take on it. What is that structure that you mentioned? Would you mind sort of trying to explore that with us a little?
Okay, so before I do that, there was something else that we did that I think started to help those Year 11s, and certainly helping our younger students, because one of the issues alongside the structure was that a number of our students didn't know much about the world around them, or certainly not as much as we would want them to. Yeah. And if you don't know much about the world around you, then that task, the AQA task on paper 2, is really difficult to respond to. So you were saying in our previous conversation that some students might not have had a bus journey, or certainly not as many bus journeys as an inner city child might have had. Some of the questions on the AQA paper relate to geography, environment and science, and all sorts of other topics, history, and also current affairs.
Cultural capital is so important.
Yeah.
History students have such an advantage with the context, the literature, and I do think actually geography students, bizarrely, seem to get a big hand with the.
Yeah, so there was one. I think it's one of the specimen papers. AQA specimen papers is about. I think it's about storms, or about volcanoes, or earthquakes, or some natural disasters. So we did that paper, and the geography students suddenly shot up in terms of the marks they were achieving for AO5, because their content was much more secure. They were using case studies that they'd learned in geography. And if you drop a case study in, you've got a whole paragraph that's really quite powerfully written. If you've got a non-geography student, even an academic non-geography student, they're at a disadvantage there. So one of the things we've done in tutor time to kind of combat that to an extent is adapt a session we ran before called What's in the News, where students were looking at current affairs. And I've modelled the structure of that around the AQA task. So they get a statement and they talk in their tutor groups about how far they agree with that statement or not, based on what little knowledge or what substantial knowledge they may or may not have. And then they're presented with 3 news articles from that week or that month, as close as I can possibly get them, so that they're fairly current, that get them thinking about the topic in more detail. So as they move through the years, and our tutor groups are vertical, Year 7 through to Year 11, so they're getting models of good analysis from some older students, or some higher prior attainers in other year groups. They're seeing how they can form and change an argument based on information they're presented with, but also over time, they're learning more about the world around them. So that was one of the things we did to combat the knowledge deficit that some of our students had. And then you asked about the actual structure that we presented them with.
Yeah.
So we got them to first of all work out what the task was, what the form was, and AQA provide guidance on what a letter should look like, what a journal should look like, what a leaflet should look, text for a leaflet should look like, who their audience was, because that plays a part in terms of the kind of language or formality that they should be using, and then to think about the topic through the statement, thinking about 3 or 4 key arguments they might make in relation to the statement. And then they build those paragraphs around the models that they've seen. And so some of the paragraphs were models of how to use an anecdote effectively, or how to use an interview they might have done with someone someone relevant to the public or an academic in that field. So they were essentially rhetorical devices, but extended into a paragraph form, rather than I'm going to litter elements of a forest here, there, and everywhere, or I must include this in this specific paragraph. And we didn't get to the point where all of our students were high academic achievers in terms of their rhetorical writing, but they improved.
Yeah, and I think it's really you spend about 7 to year 11. It's really because we know in the private sector there are entire classes. I think it's 3 times a week. My friend works in a local independent school. They do rhetoric as a subject 3 times a week. Our students do it maybe for half a term in each year through Key Stage 3. You know, this is an area where they're at a huge disadvantage compared to certain people in society.
Potentially, though, I think there's maybe I've painted a picture of our students as not being as able as others, and there are actually students, certainly in our school and others like ours, who are really high attainers, and the structure didn't prevent them from writing well. It gave them a scaffold that they could fall back on if they really needed it, but it pulled up, I think, a number of students to a threshold where certainly they'd made really good progress, and a lot of them attained well too.
Yeah, no, and I wasn't assuming that. I was more thinking that.
No, I wasn't thinking that you were.
But it's the 2 extremes, isn't it? If you deal with the 2 extremes, the middle tends to sort of often sort of be dragged forward. And I liked the idea that you said of actually giving full paragraphs as a model rather than sentences. I remember with 5 minutes of the lesson left on rhetoric, let's do 4 minutes and I'll try and teach you to use chiasmus. Well, what a waste of time. And 5 minutes of that, you know, it was an absolute disaster. So that the idea of a full paragraph that they can latch onto, try and mimic elements of, I think that's really useful, particularly with that repetition that you spoke about, and given the problem that you were describing earlier, that it was December, they needed a fast track method, but that for anyone would give a foundation to build on, even without that and those pressures. So yeah, I think that's an excellent way of approaching it, and I'm certainly, well, I won't be repeating what I've done, but I'll certainly be repeating some of the elements that you've spoken about there. I love that paragraph idea in particular.
I think in the long term, what you were suggesting, if you have got students longer than just 6 months, I think in the long term, it's important that our students, wherever we're teaching, have some understanding of the roots of persuasive or rhetorical non-fiction writing.
I mean,
but that could be sequenced really, really carefully. And I think, I made mistakes. I make mistakes every year in terms of trying to teach students things that maybe they don't have time to learn effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the journey we're all on, isn't it? Of kind of mistaking and reforming. You mentioned in the fiction writing talk that we had a moment ago about the idea of being a reflective practitioner, and I sometimes think we're almost sort of battering ourselves over the head a lot of the times of our reflection, but actually this is what it's about. It's about making purposeful elements visible to the students so that they can progress and they can go out into the world, not just get their GCSEs, but actually something I've touched on then I feel really passionate about in terms of rhetoric is that you know, they should be able to go out, hold their heads up high and argue their case with absolutely anybody, whether it be for a job in an important sector or the job they've always dreamed of, or whether it just be, you know, as a member of a political constitution, you know, constituency, because otherwise we have a group of people who become voiceless. So I think it's probably one of the most important life lessons that we ever teach, and we should feel passionate about doing it well.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think that the kind of curriculum that we teach students, especially when specification changes are made, from year 7 to 11, is different to the kind of curriculum that we're going to be teaching year 11 when the specification changed in their year 9.
Yeah. And I mean, just to finish off, you may feel that it's covered in the blog that I'll link in this one as well, but I'll put in the description of the last one. But I'll make a little request for a non-fiction writing blog in the future. I've got some great ideas here from just what you've said, and I'm sure other people will too. But it sounds like you've got a really great rondo exercise there that could develop into some Barcelona level possession football, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing to have shared. So thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for giving us your time for both of these today. Anything else you want to add before we go? I always feel like there's probably something I should have asked.
And then I'll never know.
Yeah. This is getting philosophical. We're getting a bit Wittgenstein towards the end here. Well, thank you again, Nick, and look forward to reading your next blog. I said before we started chatting that yours may be my favourite. I don't want to sort of section people off in the edgy Twitter world, but at the moment I'm sort of compulsively reading your blog. I'm absolutely loving it.
I think you better watch out, because the people of the previous videos might ask you to take their videos down.
I know. I shouldn't have said that, but the last 3 have spoken to me in particular. I should have said that. That's what I should have said. All right. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks, Todd.
Have a great day, mate.
See ya.